I do want to start with some of the latest news regarding immigration and all of those headlines that have been coming out the past several days. Taking a live look here over at California, because that's where I want to start. In fact, we just learned that yesterday on Friday, a federal judge has ordered the Trump administration to halt indiscriminate immigration stops and arrests in 7 California counties, including Los Angeles. Immigrant advocacy groups filing the lawsuit last week accusing the president's administration of systematically targeting brown-skinned people in Southern California during its ongoing immigration crackdown. The plaintiffs include 3 detained immigrants and 2 U.S. citizens, one of whom was held despite showing agents his identification. For the latest on all of these ICE raids that we have seen in California and across the country, let's get to this report from Fox News correspondent William LaJeunesse.
Hundreds of protesters clashed with federal immigration agents in Southern California on Thursday as ICE and Border Patrol agents conduct raids on 2 licensed marijuana farms in Ventura County, where officials found 8 unaccompanied minors, all here illegally. Agents deployed pepper balls, tear gas, and flashbangs, where they were met by demonstrators throwing rocks.
People are welcome to protest. They have their First Amendment rights, but they can't cross that line. They can't impede us from doing our job. That's a felony. They certainly can't put hands on an agent.
The scene became increasingly dangerous when one protester appeared to fire a gun at agents. The FBI now offering a $50,000 reward for information leading to his arrest. California Governor Gavin Newsom responding to the incident, saying the Trump administration tactics, quote, evoke chaos, fear, and terror within our communities. This as we await a ruling by a federal judge in California that could curtail some federal immigration enforcement by the administration. However, the judge saying any ruling should not be overly broad. Quote, I think it's important for the court not to burden otherwise lawful law enforcement activities.
They want ICE to stop doing this, but if they base it on the rule of law, they're going to find out Border Patrol and ICE is doing exactly what they're going to do in accordance with law.
We are expecting that ruling later today. In Los Angeles, William LaJeunesse, Fox News.
Thank you to William LaJeunesse for that report. Now, we do know that the judge has ordered a halt to several of those operations. Let's continue this conversation even further by bringing onto the program now Elizabeth Ricci. She is an immigration attorney. Elizabeth, good to see you.
Thanks for having me.
Of course. Thanks for joining us so early on this Saturday. Let's start with that order from that federal judge to halt some of those operations in California. Now, what does the court have to prove in order for that halt and that pause to stay in effect? And as we heard during that report, the Borders are Tom Homan saying that everything is being done in accordance with the law. So what do you make about both sides of this issue?
Well, I think that both of those comments just now were important. One of the comments was about indiscriminate searches, and the other was First Amendment rights. So it's a delicate balance because since President Trump returned to office, we've seen an incredible prioritization of immigration enforcement. But that enforcement has to be balanced with the law. So we need to make sure that searches and seizures, arrests, deportations are in compliance with the law and that they are not indiscriminate. We also need to make sure that people's First Amendment rights are honored. People have the right to protest peacefully, whether they're U.S. citizens or not in this country. So it is a delicate balance.
And then just to get down to the points of making sure that some of those raids are conducted in accordance with the law, what needs to be established for that to happen, given the fact that these ICE agents, they do have power to be here tracking some of the illegal immigrants that they are seeing across the country?
Sure, they have wide power, especially in open places of business. An ICE agent does not need a warrant to go into a place of business that is open to the public. They would need a warrant to go behind a counter, into a kitchen, that type of thing. But that shot that you all just showed was an open field. That is much more difficult to require a warrant and a higher standard than going behind a closed door in a private business. So if they have a warrant, then it's much easier. But if they don't have a warrant, if the area is wide open, like what you're showing on your screen right now, that's different. And it's much easier for ICE to go in and search, make arrests, and put people in deportation, regardless of whether they have a warrant or not.
So there are a lot of headlines that I want to get to with you here, Elizabeth, not just those raids that are happening in California, but I want to put up this photo here, Kilmar Abrego Garcia, because we are hearing another judge, a federal judge, actually accusing the Trump administration of refusing to provide details for the deportation plans of Kilmar Abrego here. Now, what is the government required to disclose under these circumstances? Now, just for everybody watching here, Kilmar Abrego Garcia, the Maryland man who was deported to El Salvador, he is back here in the U.S. I do believe he is being held in Tennessee facing other charges, but kind of a mess here and a back and forth as to what's going to happen with his future.
Well, I think like what we just saw recently with Mahmoud Khalil, we're going to see a lawsuit at some point. Mr. Abrego is back in Tennessee, you are correct. And this is of course after he was deported without a warrant and had already been given protections to not be deported. He was given what's called withholding of removal because the fear was that he would suffer and be persecuted by gangs in El Salvador. So he is back and he is detained partly due to the request by his own attorneys for his safety, because the concern would be that if he were released again, he would just be re-deported. But getting to your question, the Department of Justice was told that they needed to facilitate his return from El Salvador to the United States. And the response was that he would be returned or he would leave El Salvador, but not necessarily go to the United States. He would go to a third country. He is now back in the United States in Tennessee, and he is facing charges of conspiracy to smuggle or transport undocumented immigrants and actually having transported them. But as you mentioned, the judge had some problems with that. There was double hearsay. It was completely illogical to claim that he was a gang member for many, many years when he had no criminal history whatsoever. And it was illogical to claim that he had been transporting immigrants between Maryland and Texas 3 to 4 times a week. So the government is going to need to prove their case with this conspiracy charge and the charge of transporting immigrants. Otherwise, we're going to see him be released and possibly re-deported. This is going to be a long haul for him and his family, and I think it will result in a lawsuit.
Before we move on to the next topic I'd like to discuss, Elizabeth, given these two situations that I've just presented here during this discussion, the raids in California, this issue with Kilmar Abrego Garcia, and this divide that we're seeing between the federal government and many of these state and local lawmakers, have you seen cases like this in the past where there is just two completely opposite ways that both of these agencies are trying to approach the situation? Is there anything that this can be comparable to?
This is a completely unprecedented time. I have not seen anything like this before. And the whole issue here is that immigration is a federal issue to be enforced by the federal government. But because of the system, states are trying themselves. State of Florida, where I am, for example, and Florida just lost a lawsuit. They tried to enforce SB 4C, which makes it illegal to enter Florida after having entered the United States without permission, or be in Florida without having entered legally. The Supreme Court did not give a detailed opinion. They just basically upheld the previous court's ruling that that is not permissible, that it violates the federal principles of federalism. So that's the struggle, right? States' rights versus what the feds are entitled to. And because immigration is federal, states are going to continue to have an issue trying to make their own immigration laws. I give you the example of stamps or patents, for example. States cannot issue their own stamps. States cannot issue their own patents. And if a state were to try to do that, regardless of how you feel about immigration, the reasonable person would probably say the state doesn't have the authority to do that. State doesn't have the authority to enforce immigration law, but they can work in conjunction with the federal government. And that's what's going to happen to make this smoother, so we see less civil unrest like we are seeing, for example, in California.
All right, this next topic that I'd like to get to here, you mentioned it a little bit briefly within the answer previous to the one that you just gave us, but Mahmoud Khalil, we just heard this week that he is suing the Trump administration for $20 million. Elizabeth, can you break down this lawsuit for us here? Mahmoud Khalil, a reminder for our audience here, he is the Colombia activist who was detained by immigration enforcement there for his participation in some of these Gaza war protests happening at the campus in New York. But again, he is suing the Trump administration for $20 million. Elizabeth, if you can break down this lawsuit for us, and what is the likelihood that he would win this case?
Well, the lawsuit stems around the fact that he was put into deportation for exercising his First Amendment rights. He was charged basically with being un-American and an anti-Semite, and that causes, that presents a problem for foreign policy. And there is a provision of the Immigration and Nationality Act. If you are acting adversely to foreign policy, you can be put in deportation. You can be deported without traditional protections. There is an exception to that if the Secretary of State deems that you basically have the danger to foreign policy. But the problem there is that a judge has already said that that is void for vagueness. The traditional average person doesn't know what our foreign policy efforts are because foreign policy is usually covert. So he was detained for several months. He lost 15 pounds. He was in what he claims were poor conditions. He missed the birth of his child. And he is suing for $20 million for false imprisonment, for being smeared as an anti-Semite, and for malicious prosecution. And I think he may have a good case there. The question is whether his activities rose to the level of being in support of terror and whether he knew that they were. So those are the questions that will dictate whether he's going to be successful with that lawsuit or not.
And we'll be watching out to see what happens within that lawsuit. Just one more point I'd like to get to, Elizabeth. Alligator Alcatraz, I'm sure you've also been following this very closely. It's that new immigrant detention facility established in the Florida Everglades. I want to bring up some of this footage that we have here. Alligator Alcatraz, of course, that's what it's being dubbed. But earlier this week, several Florida lawmakers actually sued Governor Ron DeSantis because he has denied access to this facility. Elizabeth, what kind of access and how much access are lawmakers required to have or entitled to have to facilities like this?
Well, I think that's the question, right? How much is allowed? And I think we can see on the federal level, the president has wide discretion. In the state, a governor has wide discretion. But traditionally, lawmakers have been allowed to visit places within their constituency. They have been allowed access. It is politically traditionally allowed. Now, I know of no law that prohibits it, but there certainly can be a policy against allowing people in, whether they're politicians in the legislature or figureheads. So I think that it's probably legal. It's just not consistent with what we have done in the past, allowing members of our legislature to a facility, in this case, a very controversial one, that traditionally that would have been allowed. I think that the governor and the president can certainly deny access, but it is just not consistent with precedent. And I think it's appropriate to allow a lawmaker into a facility in their own constituency to inspect it and see for themselves what's happening, because lawmakers are part, obviously, of the process.
Well, Elizabeth, I hadn't seen you in a couple of weeks, so there was a lot to get to during this segment. I appreciate you taking the time. Is there anything that you would like to add before I let you go? Maybe a topic that you also have your eye on that we haven't discussed during this particular interview?
I imagine the next time we talk, it will probably be about the effort to denaturalize 50,000 people. And that is coming from a renewed effort to take citizenship away from people based on how they answered a question on their naturalization application. And that question is whether you have ever committed a crime for which you were not arrested. So depending on how you answered that question, if you naturalize, now the government is going back and looking at what you have done and said before that application. And if they feel there were a willful misrepresentation, they're making efforts again to denaturalize 50,000 people. And we're seeing that right now in the case of the mayoral candidate in New York City, who's a naturalized US citizen. And there is talk about denaturalizing him based on some comments that he had made regarding what is perceived as terrorism, basically his position on Israel. So if that is considered support of terrorism, then they could proceed with denaturalization efforts. That is very unusual, and it has to go through federal court, but we are seeing a renewed effort to do that. So I have a feeling that's what we'll be talking about next.
And we'll be having that conversation very soon, Elizabeth. Very unusual times and unprecedented times, especially when it comes to immigration and some of this enforcement across the country. But Elizabeth Ricci, immigration attorney, always a pleasure to have you here at Live Now from Fox. You take care. We're going to check in soon.
Thank you.
We're going to step away for a brief commercial break. Before I do so, though, I want to put up a post from Homeland Security here. Take a look at your screen. It says, quote, "A district judge is undermining the will of the American people. America's brave men and women are removing murderers, MS-13 gang members, pedophiles, rapists. Truly the worst of the worst from Golden State communities. Law and order will prevail." And this is in reference to some of those raids that we've seen happening in California over the last several weeks. We'll be right back.